There are two main senses that one can hear in the phrase, the prosthetic imagination, I think. The first thinks of the imagination itself as a prosthetic device. So the prosthetic imagination is the imagination as a prosthetic. One of the things that my book sets out to do is to conduct a thought experiment where we imagine that the novel itself is a prosthetic device and work out what that would mean for how we think about what the task and value of the novel is from its earliest beginnings to the present day. That the novel actually brings us somehow into the world, acting as an extension of our rather diminished small selves. The second sense runs alongside the first and is really encouraging us to imagine what work we need to do in order to bring prosthetic material to life, to animate it in some sense. One can imagine that all body parts, all biopolitical structures, all forms of being are in some sense prosthetic. They're in some sense not living. You only have to think about your hair or your fingernails to realise that we're made of material that isn't fully animated by life. And one of the tasks of being alive, and one of the tasks of the novel, is to produce the imaginative force that allows us to take prosthetic material, inanimate material, and make it living, make it feel like the real bedrock of the self. An example of both those senses, both the prosthetic imagination as a device and the prosthetic imagination as the force that allows us to make the device come to life, would be Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick, which contains, I imagine, the most famous prosthetic in the history of the novel in Captain Ahab's whalebone leg. Now that novel represents itself throughout as a prosthetic device. It encourages us from the first page to the last to imagine that the page is skin, that the information encoded in the novel is fossil or bone, and the novel holds itself up not as referring to something but as being that something itself, being prosthetic life. At the same time as acting in this way as a prosthetic device, it also contains the most powerful attempt to imagine prosthetics that we can think of in the history of the novel, in Captain Ahab's attempt to imagine his own dismembered body is real and complete. Ahab looks throughout the novel to be made of stone or wood or brass. His leg is obviously made of whalebone. He's this very discrete and materially varied kind of being. And what the novel is desperately trying to do is take that material and make it into fully self-conscious being. The novel does have access to an interiority that is unique to the novel form, different from all other art forms, I think. What I call throughout the book the prosthetic condition or the prosthetic junction is the place where mind, interiority, non-existence meets with material extension, the body or the world, whichever you prefer. And the novel is better than any other art form at getting access to that very hidden junction. So you can see something like mind moving in material in a Shakespeare soliloquy. You can see that relationship between interiority and exteriority in the cinema, in film and television, even in poetry. But there's no art form that manages to get such intimate access to the way that thought materializes itself. George Eliot, in a wonderful phrase, calls this following the mental act as it struggles towards clearness. And the novel encamps itself in precisely that junction or that hidden seam where mind finds itself realised in body. And that's why it's such a powerful form for addressing what I think of as the prosthetic junction between being and its attachments. Claire Colebrook's recently suggested in an essay that all life is artificial life. And we only have to think about a line in Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents to realise why this is so. Freud imagines that we're all born as naked sucklings, what he calls a mere inch of nature. But of course, as soon as we address ourselves as human beings, we engage with tools and with other forms of enhancement that mean that we aren't merely ourselves, we're always artificially enhanced. Heidegger tells us that as soon as we're human beings assisted by tools. Those tools might be writing or recording devices, or books or paintings. They may be pulleys or levers, or arrows or guns or spades. But being human is about being artificial. And the history of the novel, as I tell it here, is a history of a critical examination of the ways in which artificial enhancements are attached to interior life in order to make our life worlds thinkable, from Thomas More in 1516 to the present day. That's the task of the novel, to engage with artificial life at the same time as imagining what a fully realised life world might be like. It was a difficult decision to decide to write a book with such a long timeline from 1516 to the present, although I even engage with the history of the novel from Greek antiquity in the introduction to the book. The reason I decided to write a single author monograph that has such a large reach, however unwise that may be, is because it seemed to me that I needed to find a way of telling the story of the novel as a whole at a time when our understanding of what the purpose and value of the novel is very uncertain, as a way of trying to address this very central pressing question: how does the novel engage in the task of generating pictures of the world, making the world real for us? The only way I could find of doing that was to try to set a dialogue in process where I could put Thomas More in discussion with Jane Austen, with George Eliot, with Bram Stoker, with Toni Morrison, with Samuel Beckett, so that you could, through that dialogue, produce an unfolding picture of how the novel has engaged with the question of a prosthetic condition, the question of artificial intelligence, the question of artificial life, as it becomes the dominant question of our time for us now. While my book tells a long history of the novel over many centuries, it is at its heart a contemporary project. Its starting off point is my conviction that we are living at a time when the prosthetic condition is transforming the culture more deeply perhaps than any other transformation that one can easily imagine. Only this year there's been the invention of a camera eye that can be probed directly into your brain to cure blindness. So it's now feasible for us to imagine that we could prosthetically enhance vision, not only for blind people but for all of us, so that we could all see at a distance. These kinds of medical changes to artificial life forms are profound and transformative, as are advances in artificial intelligence, advances in computing, how computing produces the environments that we live in. Even eco-crisis is a question really of a failure of the relationship between the artificial and the natural. Everything is transformed by these changes, and the second most profound conviction in my book is that the novel as a long form is an archive of knowledge about the prosthetic condition, an archive of knowledge about how mind meets with the forms in which it knows itself. So the long history of the novel I offer here is in some sense a response to the sense that the prosthetic condition needs to be rethought. And it might mean that we need to look to the future to rethink that condition, but it's also the case that the novel holds a long, long history of centuries of probing the place where mind meets with matter, to give us an archive or an image bank or a thought bank to help us orient ourselves in relation to a world that's changing beyond recognition.